As people from Berks County, we often hear ghost stories of settlers killed by the savages from over the mountain. But these 18th century tales raise questions. What really happened in Berks County during the French and Indian War? To understand the history of Pennsylvania, we must also understand the origins of the people and the history of the province. The area that is now Philadelphia and stretching from the coast of New Jersey to the east and reaching as far as the Susquehanna River at its most extreme was not always populated by European settlers. It ran from the north, bordering the Muncie near New Amsterdam, and to the south below the mouth of the Delaware Bay. The Lenape tribe inhabited this space. However, the first European settlers that settled in the area were from Sweden and other Nordic countries. Soon after, the Dutch from New Amsterdam were spreading south, expanding the colony of New Netherland. Eventually, the Dutch took the rogue colony through military force. However, the Swedish, Norwegian, and now Dutch settlers there retained much autonomy and were the symbol of one man's dream of a perfect colony. Separation of church and state, a representative government, a Supreme Court. That man's name was William Penn. After the British took control of all the territories of New Netherland in 1664, life remained much the same for the Nordic settlers until 1681. That year, William Penn received his charter from the king, granting him the land they lived on. Penn received both his fortune and this charter mostly through his father, who had been an admiral in the Royal Navy. Penn first arrived in his new province in 1682, shaking the hands of the Swedes who had lived there for so long. Penn envisioned a province where forts were not a necessity, where they could live peacefully with their European neighbors to the north and the south and their Native American neighbors to the west. Fast forward 70 years, and the colony was looking much less like his vision. Competing land claims with Maryland had sparked hatred between the colonies in years prior. The relationship with the Native Americans had also started to sour, sparking violence on the frontier. So what had changed? As it turns out, lots. Penn originally had bought all the land for the province. However, after he died, his sons began stealing the land from the Native Americans who had originally lived there. By the 1740s and 50s, the Native Americans had realized that the peaceful days of William Penn were over. If they wanted to retain the little land that they had left, they would have to show the encroaching governments that they meant business. Just north of Bethel, Berks County, at 4 p.m. on November 15, 1755, a group of Berks County associators are ambushed by a group of Native Americans on their way to the house of Dietrich VI. Later in the day, homes and settlements in the area would be raided by Native Americans. A small battle between settlers and Native Americans raged throughout the night. This moment marked the first time during the French and Indian War that violence was brought to Berks County. Conrad Weiser, a respected member of Berks society, had recently become commissioned as a lieutenant colonel. He traveled to the area of the attack on November 19th, hoping to settle matters with the Native Americans peacefully. However, while on the road with the Native Americans, 4 local men confronted him, and told him of a large crowd gathered at their meeting spot. The men tell Weiser of a crowd, about 500 people, waiting to kill the Native Americans. However, Weiser's persistence wins out, and they travel to the area. Nearing their destination, Weiser and the Native Americans can hear the crowd before they get there. What the men on the road said is unfortunately true. An immense crowd is gathered to kill the Native Americans, armed with everything from muskets to kitchen knives. Weiser still hopes he can settle it peacefully. After a struggle, they gain access into the building. The talks reportedly end well, with the Lenape representatives leaving with friendly feelings towards Weiser. However, the crowd would not let Weiser leave. Shouts of Indian lover and traitor began ringing out from the crowd. Soon, hoping to quell the settlers' fears, they draw up a plan for the defense of the area. This involves the raising of a militia. This proclamation was read to the crowd, who immediately erupted in an angered frenzy. After this, Weiser and his men retreated back inside. Staring out at the crowd from a lower level window, confused as to what to do, one of his officers pulled him away from the window. Weiser later says in a letter to the governor,
"Some to curse the governor, some the assembly, called me a traitor of the country, who held with the Indians and must have known this murder beforehand."
However, after a few hours of barricading themselves inside the house, they realized that the crowd had begun to scatter. They had seen smoke on the horizon, and they believed that the Native Americans who had just left were attacking their homes. However, this was a false alarm. Nevertheless, the people scattered, and Weiser returned to his home in Womelsdorf, where he began preparing for an attack from the settlers. Some of the more extreme of the populace believed they should seek help from the French, because up to this point they had seen no protection offered from the British. During this time, conflict between the General Assembly and the governor would reach dangerous levels. Excursions by French and Native American forces into Pennsylvania, such as the one in Tulpehocken, on top of the recent news of Braddock's defeat and death, rose tensions to an all-time high. The General Assembly, for the first time in its history, attempted to fundraise and recruit a state militia. Although not opposed to this, Governor Robert Morris vehemently denounced the bill because of the inclusion of the proprietors, now the sons of William Penn, properties being taxed.
Since writing the letter herewith, I have received intelligence that the Indians have crossed the Susquehanna and fallen upon the inhabitants to the southward of the mountains at and near a place called Tulpehocken, about 60 miles from hence, where they had, when the express came away, burnt several houses and killed such of the inhabitants as could not escape from them. The settlement they are now destroying is one of the finest in this province. The lands are very rich and well improved. My assembly have now been sitting ever since the 3rd instance, but have done nothing for the defence of the province, nor raised any supply. The bill they have proposed for that purpose, being of the same kind of one I had before refused to pass, and which they know I have no power by my commission to pass it. Such a conduct, while the country is bleeding, seems to me to merit the severest censure.
Both the governor and the proprietors refused to contribute to the fund, until finally when they made a donation to the assembly. The proprietors swore it wasn't them saying they could be taxed, while the assembly swore it wasn't them admitting they had no right to tax them. Neither side would budge. Regardless, the Pennsylvania Regiment was formed 2 weeks after the attack in Berks. The Pennsylvania Regiment was divided into 3 battalions. The first, under Conrad Weiser, manned the forts east of the Susquehanna River. The 2nd Battalion manned the forts west of the Susquehanna, while the 3rd, or Augusta Battalion, manned the Fort Augusta and its tributaries on the Susquehanna River. Conrad Weiser's men manned 3 forts in the then borders of Berks County. They included Fort Lebanon, Fort Northkill, and Fort Henry. However, there was a 4th, but saying it was a fort was a bit of an overstatement. It was simply a blockhouse on top of the mountain, and it was named Fort Dietrich Snyder. Beginning in the east, Fort Lebanon is currently located between the present-day towns of Auburn and Deer Lake on Fort Lebanon Road. Fort Lebanon was commanded by Captain James Morgan. Morgan would go on to be an important figure in Berks County, being one of its delegates to the Provincial Congress in 1775 and the Pennsylvania Congressional Convention of 1776. Numerous attacks would take place around Fort Lebanon, causing the populace to retreat to the fort. Ironically, however, its biggest claim to fame is being the parent fort of Fort Northkill. In January of 1756, Captain Morgan is told to send men to build and garrison a fort, halfway between Fort Henry and his own. He calls it Fort Northkill for its location close to the Northkill Creek. The current position of Fort Northkill is deep in the woods north of Fort Road near Strausstown. Fort Northkill was commanded by a sergeant, who was found to be derelict of his duties soon after its construction. Instead, Captain Morgan sent Lieutenant Humphreys of his company to command the fort. Under his supervision, the fort would improve in its conditions. It should be noted, however, that these forts were extremely rushed in their construction and didn't do much to prevent Native American attacks. In the spring of 1756, Governor Robert Morris, worsening conditions, calls for volunteer scalping parties to travel over the mountains and kill Native Americans. On November 3, 1756, nearly a year after the original attack on Berks, Fort Northkill lies silent. With its garrison nearing the end of the night's slumber and the recently arrived cold morning air evident by the visible breath of the centuries, all is peaceful on the Kittatinny Ridge. A faint pounding of the earth begins, but soon it becomes louder and louder, till a man on a horse is seen, desperate for the fort's attention. He tells Lieutenant Humphreys that his son has been kidnapped. Humphreys immediately sets out with 7 men, soon accompanied by about 20 farmers from the area. All day they search for the boy, but they have no luck in finding him. They return to the fort in the evening, but set out once again in the morning. Finding nothing once more, they begin to return to the fort. However, on their way, the party sees smoke and hears gunshots in the distance. They rush to the house of Nicholas Long, with it on fire with 3 families trapped in the basement. Immediately, seeing the scene, the farmers desert the party, leaving the provincial soldiers to fend for themselves. Soon they are under fire by a party of about 25 Lenape. For 5 minutes the battle rages on, with 1 provincial soldier shot in the side and 2 Lenape killed. After forcing them to retreat, Humphreys and his men put out the fire and pulled the families out from the cellar. 2 old men had been killed in the attack. The soldiers soon return to the fort, and Humphreys begins to write his report to Captain Morgan and Colonel Weiser. While doing so, he finds 4 musket ball holes in his jacket, while he himself received nothing more than a scare. As a result of the incident, Humphreys is commended by his superiors for his bravery, but tensions rise between the farmers and the provincial soldiers for letting them out to dry. Throughout 1757, attacks, including the most famous of the time, occur, including the Hochester and Bloody Spring massacres, displaying how ineffective the current implements were at deterring attacks. The most the forts did were providing the populace with a false sense of security. Fort Northkill was abandoned sometime in early 1758 as a part of a reduction in the number of forts and soldiers throughout Pennsylvania as a result of decreasing tensions with Native Americans, which culminated in the Conrad Weiser interpreted Treaty of Easton, where a majority of the Pennsylvania tribes, including the Lenape, agreed to abandon their support for the French. This came as a result of increasing English victories in the war. With their Native American support collapsing, the French could no longer hold their position in Pennsylvania, with the Forbes expedition to capture Fort Duquesne being the nail in the coffin. Further west, the next fort in the line is the small, not-so-fort-like Fort Dietrich Snyder. It was a simple log house built on the old Shamokin Road going over the top of the Blue Mountains. It is located on the present-day Appalachian Trail near where Route 183 crosses over the mountains. It was never manned by more than a few soldiers, but it was mostly used as a lookout point for fires on the countryside. Due to its proximity to Fort Northcote, it was undoubtedly manned by soldiers from there. Heading further west, you come to Fort Henry, north of present-day Bethel. It was erected right next to the property of Dietrich VI, the place where the original attacks began in 1755. It was by far the most substantial fort along the mountains, boasting 3-foot-thick stone walls in some places. However, no reliable account exists of the actual shape of the fort. There's a description saying it was a half circle, but this is very unhelpful and is not consistent with any other fort built in the colonies during this time period. Using many different sources, I have come to my best approximated guess. The fort had 200-foot-long walls, on 3 sides having bastions jut out from the main fort. Surrounding the fort was a ring of tall logs known as a stockade. Behind these was a shallow gully. On January 25, 1756, Captain Christian Busey is ordered to construct a fort near Tulpehocken. In letters to Governor Dinwiddie and Colonel George Washington of Virginia, Governor Morris says about the forts lining the mountains.
The most considerable of them is built at an important pass through the Kittatinny Hills on our northern frontier, and I have called it Fort Henry.
In June 1757, Fort Henry received a visitor. The visitor was newly elected Governor Denny, who had come for 2 reasons. The first was to move 3 companies from Weiser's battalion to the monumental Fort Augusta, where a Native American attack was expected, right as most of the men stationed there's enlistments ran out. Among those sent to Augusta were Weiser's personal friend Christian Busey, along with his company. Denny also wanted to raise a militia for the area in addition to the provincial force, which was quickly accomplished. However, no new provincial soldiers were enlisted, worsening an already severe manpower shortage in the forts commanded by Conrad Weiser. On October 1, 1757, after unmanned forts caused deaths on the frontier, Weiser writes to the governor, saying,
I humbly entreat your honor to pity our cause and give orders that the men belonging to the 1st Battalion of Pennsylvania's regiment, now at Fort Augusta, may all return to their proper or former station. When this present trouble is over, I will gladly send a reinforcement again either to Fort Augusta or wherever your honor pleases. It is certain that the enemy is numerous on our frontiers, and the people are coming away very fast, so that the forts are left to themselves with the men in them, but no more neighbors about them.
3 days later, Weiser writes another letter to the governor's secretary, pleading that the soldiers be sent back. Ultimately, the soldiers are sent back to their former posts along the Berks County frontier. However, one is not among them. Captain Busey has fallen very ill, and during this time, Conrad Weiser went to visit him. Meanwhile, back at Fort Henry, a French soldier surrenders to its garrison. The only French soldier confirmed to be east of the Blue Mountains in Berks County. He was the son of a lieutenant of the French Marines who commanded Fort Michaud out west. He had been sent to lead a party of Native Americans to raid the countryside. He said that while traveling, he had dropped a loaf of bread and had gone back to look for it. Soon enough, he had become separated from his group and had spent a week without food. The young soldier had been forced to surrender to Fort Henry to avoid starvation. The fort would be abandoned in the winter of 1758 to 1759, another result of the Treaty of Easton. With his health wavering, Conrad Weiser relinquished command of his battalion and retired to his home in Wilmersdorf. As Pontiac's rebellion began in mid-1763, Governor James Hamilton ordered that Fort Henry be reoccupied by 100 provincial soldiers. The fort was abandoned as Pontiac's United Tribes began losing their war against the encroaching English. With the threat subsided, Fort Henry would be abandoned for the final time, and all of the forts would be slowly reclaimed by nature. Stone markers still tell the spots of many of these places though. As for Conrad Weiser, He was also reclaimed by nature in 1760. Upon hearing of his death, George Washington said, "This departed man rendered many services to his country in a difficult period, and posterity will not forget him."